Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit and welcome to this week's episode. So if you've been here before, you know that these episodes that I release usually on Monday or Tuesday are my contemplations for the week ahead. And so this is for the week of February 13th, 2023. And if you happen to find this episode outside of the week that that I'm talking about here, then consider that maybe some of the messages here are also for you. And I encourage you, as always, to listen intuitively, listen to inspire your own knowing, and to feel into what may be relevant here for you. So, as always, I like to begin with the overview of the astrology of the coming week. On Wednesday, February 15th, Venus in Pisces is going to be creating a conjunction with Neptune in Pisces. On Thursday, the 16th, Mercury in Aquarius is going to be squaring the lunar nodes, which are currently in Taurus and Scorpio. And also on the same day, Sun in Aquarius is going to be creating a conjunction with Saturn, also in Aquarius. On Friday the 17th, Mercury in Aquarius will be sextiling Jupiter in Aries. On Saturday the 18th, Sun will be entering Pisces. And then on Sunday the 19th, Venus in Pisces will be sextiling Pluto in Capricorn. So when I felt into the energy of this coming week, what I felt into was that there are a couple different strands of energies that I'm perceiving this week. The first strand is kind of this whole Pisces Aquarius energy that we are swimming in, which feels more etheric, more dreamy, more internal. And then there's the other strand of energy, which is the more visceral, the more full-bodied energy of Aquarius contrasted with Taurus and Scorpio and also Aries, right? So I decided to narrow down the contemplation for this week on the first strand here. And that's not because I don't like the other strand or I don't feel like the other strand is important, but because I think that this strand of energy, this dimension that's perhaps a little bit more subtle, is in some ways requiring more of our attention to be able to tap into and to listen to. Subtlety doesn't mean that, just because something is subtle doesn't mean it's not equally potent, right? In my own life, time and time again, I've found that ignoring subtle energies can actually end up creating unnecessary resistance, unnecessary friction, both internally and externally. And also, I believe that tapping into this more subtle field, and to be clear, that is the Pisces Aquarius field, may really help us create space from the more visceral, the more corporeal struggles. And that space may be exactly what we needed in order to approach the situations that are arising with a little bit more magnanimity and a little more access to our creative force. And it may also assist us in transmuting some of the more physical, the more tangible struggle if that comes up in a way that's unavoidable. So that's where we're going to go. And perhaps at the end, I'll also tie the two strands back together. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Venus in conjunction with Neptune in Pisces, as well as Sun in conjunction with Saturn in Aquarius, right? To me, Venus conjunct Neptune activates the dream realm, right? Whereas the Sun creating a conjunction with Saturn activates this realm of philosophical possibilities, right? Philosophical, I don't think analysis is quite the right word, but maybe philosophical vision. Venus, so let's talk about each of them kind of separately, right? Venus-Neptune conjunction is interesting because it's not just Venus-Neptune that's happening this coming week, but it's also kind of preparing the way to the entrance of the sun later in the week into the all-encompassing, into the quantum field of Pisces, right? In some ways, the veil is thin. I know that that's a phrase that we often use for Scorpio season, but this is a different kind of thinness of the veil, right? I think there's a heightened awareness in the realm of Pisces of the inherent feature of reality where boundaries between us as humans and between us humans and the world around us are actually not really as strict as we think it is, right? There is a sense of being supported through the spirit realm, but I think in Pisces, it's not so much about, the novelty, right, of the spirit realm, but it's just more about the isness, right? About the very fact that they're always available and that all we need to do is just increase our ability to become aware of them. And then the Sun-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, to me, illuminates the realm of mental possibilities, right? Aquarius is an air sign. Aquarius is traditionally related to Saturn or ruled by Saturn. And so, to me, Aquarius is also associated with interconnectedness, but it's different, right? It's interconnectedness in the way that the internet is interconnected, right? It's interconnectedness in a way that the law of a particular country holds the people together, holds the society together, right? Aquarius is interconnected in a sense that maybe it's more about being able to read people's thoughts, not because of one's psychic abilities, but because one is coming from a very similar cultural lens or background, right? In a way, Aquarius is more detached, although in some ways I think Pisces can also be quite detached, right? So the way that I think this is interesting to think about, to kind of ground it into maybe more concrete examples, is Aquarius and Pisces and the contrast as well as similarities between them is making me think about the connection between mystical spiritual teachings and the genre of science fiction, right? And how the two very often feel similar to me. I recently started watching this TV show, which was apparently discontinued recently, which I'm very sad about. It's called The Expanse, right? And I think you can watch this on Amazon Prime, even though I'm not associated with Amazon Prime, just to be clear. But I'm trying to illustrate a point here. At the same time, I've also been dipping further into the exploration of the tradition of Christian mystics through this podcast by James Finley, Turning to the Mystics, right? Which actually, this one I highly recommend if you're into that kind of stuff. And what's fascinating to me in kind of dipping my toes into these two seemingly separate or disparate worlds simultaneously is how science fiction and mysticism share a similar end goal, right? Which is both of them are an exploration of the unknown. Both of them serve as a vehicle or a body of knowledge that is at the frontier of the edges of our inner universe and our outer universe. However, as anybody who's watched a science fiction movie and also indulge in mystical texts can attest, right? The flavor, the genre, the color palette of the two are very different, right? They use different languages. Their vocabularies, their syntaxes are very different, right? But because they're bound by similar goals, they often end up in very similar places. So to me, Aquarius and Pisces, in their relationships, have a similar flavor too. They're very different to one another in terms of the style, but there's sympathy, right, in these two energies. When I think about Pisces, I think of maybe mantra meditation or astral traveling, right, when you're sleeping or even when you're half awake. Meanwhile, to me, Aquarius is associated with modalities like breath work, right? Both of them bring us into that transcendent state, but achieves that state in a very different way. And even when you are in that transcendent state, to me, the quality of experience is very, very different. All that being said, I feel like this week, where my contemplation is going is into this exploration of how can we make more space for the spiritual and philosophical dimensions in our lives, right? All of us here listening to this are probably humans who have to pay bills, who have to, do mundane chores like driving kids to school, right? Filing our taxes. And it can feel really hard to make space for these moments in our lives, right? Where we touch into the spiritual, the philosophical dimensions. And I'm not talking about spiritual dimension or accessing the spiritual or the philosophical from a space of, I need to do this, right? As like daily maintenance. I'm really talking about dropping in deeper, right? An exploration that's driven by either a hunger or a desire, right? To be in that state, to kind of get lost for a certain amount of time. As someone who doesn't have kids, although I still have to pay taxes, unfortunately, I can also see that there is another side of the coin, right? There's another part of this experience, which is that the absence of duties, the absence of obligations, doesn't necessarily and doesn't automatically mean that you are going to do the thing that you want to do, right? So I'm going to give myself as an example here, which is that, I have space to be able to explore some of my favorite hobbies, like maybe music, right? But just because I have, there are days where I have a lot more space in my schedule, in my calendar, but that doesn't automatically drive me into going into those pursuits, right? The thing that we want or that our soul on a very deep level yearn to experience is not always available to us simply because we make space for it, or that there's space lying around that we can do it, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that sometimes we can have this feeling of like, I don't have the space or I don't have the time to dip into this. And some of that is valid. And also, other times, it's not that we don't have the space. The lack of space is not the problem. Sometimes the lack of space is simply a reflection or a symptom of perhaps not having contemplated on a deeper level what the reason, what the yearning is to actually create the psychic, the emotional space that is necessary to explore these realms, right? So this is the point in our contemplation here, where my personal tendency would be to start going into a lecture mode, right? Into talking about the benefits of cultivating deeper relationships with the spiritual, the philosophical dimensions in our lives. But I feel like actually, because I'm talking to all of you listening to this podcast, this lecture mode is probably not as useful. If you are listening to this podcast, chances are you're already into spiritual exploration on some level, right? In some shape or form. Perhaps even more so if you've been listening this far and you haven't been skipping along to whatever the next thing is you have queued up on your podcast app, right? So instead of lecturing, I'm going to share, I'm going to invite us into this space of questions. So feel into what's coming up for you as I'm asking these questions. What would you say is your relationship to the spiritual or the philosophical dimension? Both on a larger, overarching perspective, as well as on a daily basis. Do you make time to connect to either dimension? Is it perhaps easier for you to access one over the other? Do you think that the spiritual and the philosophical are separate? Or do you feel them as a merged field? Or perhaps that there is a border between the two? And if there's a border, how porous is this border? How mutable is this border? I'm also curious, in what ways do you feel like the spiritual or the philosophical nourish you in your specific lived experience and a specific geography of your physical, emotional, mental, spiritual body? Conversely, are there aspects of the spiritual or the philosophical that maybe makes you uncomfortable in some shape or form? And finally, I'm also curious to hear if there are any activities, right? If there are any beings, maybe humans or other than humans, or places that connect you to that spiritual dimension. And likewise, are there any activities, any beings, any places that connect you to that philosophical dimension? I'm talking specifically about a natural kind of connection here, right? Some sort of immediate or gradual induction into that dimension. I'm going to give a little bit of an example to maybe illuminate this and feel into what's coming up for you as I'm sharing this example. For me, almost always playing music gets me there one way or another, right? Even when I'm not necessarily playing something that inspires me. And this is a little surprising for me. Some of you may know that I went to college to study piano performance ages ago at this point. And up until today, I'm still amazed at the level and the quality of flow that I can access, even when I'm just playing finger exercises, right? Or even if I'm just playing etudes. It's quite mind-boggling to me because it seems like this state of flow is not just related to playing some sort of transcendent musical piece, right? Or accessing this limitless realm from which I can compose, right? Or I can draw inspiration to create something new. But that the spiritual dimension or the spiritual experience that I have when I'm playing music is also inherent in the physical act of it, you know? Similarly, practicing vocal exercises that are not necessarily beautiful songs, right, also get me there in a very interesting way. And so I encourage you to spend some time thinking about this, right? Feel into how you know when that space is activated for you. When are you in that spiritual or philosophical dimension, right? How do you feel in that space? What feels exciting? What feels expansive? And what feels scary? What feels contractive, right? And let's go a little deeper into this, right? Because I think one of the key components to being able to access this, not always, right? But one of the most potent portal into going into this dimension to me is the idea of solitude, right? So I'm not saying that we all need to be alone all the time and we have to be mystics, at the top of the mountain. That's not what I'm saying. But I do feel like a lot of us can probably benefit from contemplating where in our lives we are yearning to fall in love with solitude, right? Not just tolerate solitude, not just be okay with solitude. But where is it? In which areas of your life do you really want to fall in love with just being by yourself? Where must you go alone? Now, generally, I'm a pretty social person. I love being very stimulated. I have a Gemini moon, after all. I love listening to podcasts, being in conversation with different people, doing a lot of different things. I'm a very mercurial person. So I think there's deep value in having exchanges of thoughts, exchanges of feelings with different people, because in some ways, that connection, right, is what colors our reality. At the same time, especially as mystics, as spiritual seekers, many of us also recognize that there are certain knowings, there are certain states, there are certain ways of truly deeply listening that we simply cannot achieve when we're consistently in the presence of others, right? And so creating the space intentionally between us and the rest of the world, while also remembering that we are inherently interconnected, is, I think, one of the greatest paradoxes of being human, right? If we deny ourselves of having the space to hear what is coming from within, right? From the genuine well of our own experience and what it feels to be the human that we are specifically, right? We're going to be denying ourselves the opportunity, the privilege of really connecting with this piece of divinity that is always within us, right? At the same time, there is also a very human tendency to use that space, right, between us and the world to look away or to run away or to pretend that we're not connected, to pretend that we're not reliant upon the greater web of life, right? And so holding the both and, the paradox here seems like the key to me, right? Energetically, this coming week, I really felt like there are opportunities to touch into that very powerful, that very still dimension. And to do so, it's often helpful to actually clear things away from our field and our plate. Something that I've been thinking about is that sometimes clarity can be found through an active search, right? And other times, clarity comes from actual clearing. So I really see this in a lot of the different communities that I find myself in. As, you know, this is obviously not a binary, right? It's just more of a spectrum. But there are people who are way more into journaling, and there are people who are way more into meditating. And usually there can be, there's a lot of overlap, obviously, in between, but there are people who are like, I'm just a meditator, or like, I'm just a journaler, right? And I think this is interesting, or this is an interesting microcosm of this question that I'm posing here, right? Because I do think that the active search and the passive receiving, or what seems like passive receiving from the outside, are actually different pathways, right? And different pathways lead us to different realms, and different realms lead us to different knowings or different qualities of knowings. And so the question here, I think that's specifically pertinent for this week, is where must we embrace the clarity that can come from actual clearing rather than active search, right? We come from, a lot of us, especially those who are touched by Western civilizations, and let's be real, who isn't? We come from this very diurnal, very active culture, right? It's easy to try to find clarity by actively searching. Add to this dimension the fact that we have such advanced technologies, right? Knowledge is always at your fingertips on a very tangible level. For me, for example, like I mentioned, it's easy to throw myself into more books, more podcasts, more conversations, more discussions, more exposure to various thought lineages that I can derive from, right? That I can derive insight from. And then sometimes not always, this insight is confused with clarity, right? Sometimes I reach a certain point in my active search and it feels to me like, wow, this is so clear, right? Suddenly something becomes so available to me and so apparent to me. And sometimes that's true, and that's a permanent thing. It has a lasting effect. And other times, it's actually just a drug, right? Of receiving certain information that lights something up within the neuron of your experiences and of your perspective. But over time, as you live with the knowledge that you are procuring on a mental level, you might find yourself adjusting in unexpected ways, right? You might find yourself not really staying there, not really fully living in that space of knowing, because maybe the knowledge that you receive from the outside world is simply a vehicle, right? To bring you from one place to another, to bring you from one way of understanding reality to another spot, right? That is probably a neighboring spot or even like a very distant area, right? Or a very distant destination. So I found that in my search, in my own life, it's a lot harder to let myself be in maybe a ritual space where I just drown or I just let myself merge into this trance state, right? Or maybe even just go for a walk and wander aimlessly without feeling like I need to know where I'm going, right? Or to submerge myself in a warm bath to just release things from my system. That's a much more difficult way of being, at least for me, than the other way of being, which is like getting more information, right? Like fattening myself up with more knowledge, more thoughts, more frameworks, right? It's a lot harder to slow down, to make space to listen. So this week, my invitation is for all of us to try feeling into the ways that we can make a little extra space, right? On a very practical level, what's really helped me is actually the practice of blocking my calendar. When there's a huge block that I place in my calendar scheduled for me to do nothing, there tends to be more permission to get bored, right? To mess around, to maybe even engage in activities that at first maybe seems like a waste of time for me, right? But ultimately, wasting time, right? Or like letting our mind wander is a truly necessary part of tapping into our intelligent human nature. So the other thing that I would invite us into deeper contemplation of is, where am I unconsciously buying into the illusion of separation between the dimension of my mundane reality and the dimension of my spiritual or philosophical states, right? Or realms. I'll speak briefly to this because I feel like I've kind of touched upon it a little bit with some of the suggestions and the examples I shared. Like, for example, I think this idea, right, of putting a giant block on your calendar to do nothing can be this way of tapping into the spiritual and the philosophical through the mundane, right? Something that's been coming up a lot in different conversations for me is this idea that our humanity is actually the portal to our divinity, right? Now, this may sound like a very esoteric concept, but trust me, this is not new, right? Like, if you look at ancient Zen tradition, right, there's even a saying of like, chop wood, carry water, right, as being the path to enlightenment. So this idea of the mundane being the vessel into which we can transport ourselves into the divine realm or the divine dimension is really nothing special, right? And this is something that is shared across different traditions across the world. I do think that sometimes there's a binary that we are kind of creating in our minds, right? When the reality is that we are simply working with two sides of the same coin. Like, maybe the mundane and the spiritual, right, are connected. Like, I'm even thinking about our brains, right? That sometimes we are so trained to achieve the state of focus in this culture, when actually those transcendent states can only be entered through daydreaming, right? Through relaxing, through wandering, right? And there's so much value in wandering, in letting ourselves just completely go without a plan, but it can be so difficult because we live in a body that's traumatized by the unknown, right? All of us have had unpredictable events happen to us that impact us on a very deep level. And so a lot of us are scared, of falling into that space of the unknown, right? But what if we give ourselves an opportunity to dilate our minds, right? To dilate our hearts, to expand our awareness, to begin seeing each moment of our lived experience as this incredible opportunity to touch into the spiritual, into the philosophical, right? That perhaps no area of life is too small or too insignificant to be included in our spiritual dimension, right? This is something that took me a while to understand. And I think for a lot of people too, right? That embodying this sense of the spiritual and the philosophical being inherent in everything takes time and takes practice, right? So what does that practice look like for you? All right, so let's get deeper into my recommendation around practices, right? I actually want to refer you to this beautiful breathwork meditation app that I truly love, and it's called Open. And I've had this app for about over a year now. And this app has been at my fingertip as my companion for my contemplative, for my meditative practice, and it's been truly incredible. It's interesting because I remember the first time I heard about Open, and it was through Michelle Pelazon of Holisticism, and I remember being intrigued, but then also kind of like delaying on it. I don't know why that is, but there was like a really long period of time between me hearing about it to finally actually giving it a try. And honestly, once I crossed that threshold, I just couldn't even, I don't even understand why I waited for that long, The way the app looks and feels, the level of care that each practitioner who is featured on the app and each contributor pours into each and every exercise, the selection of music is just so breathtaking and it's so next level. And it's almost like, I don't know, like a part of me feels like, what is this and how has this not been a part of my daily experience since forever? Like how did I not know that this is what's missing in my life, So, I also am aware that for a lot of people, the idea of like meditating through an app is, I feel like culturally it's gone from like this really novel idea into like kind of this really annoying idea. Like, I don't know how you all feel about it. Maybe you have different experiences, but I've kind of become disillusioned a little bit with the idea of practicing meditation or breath work through an app. But Open, I think, is so thoughtful and so beautifully designed that it makes the experience of practicing meditation and breathwork really irresistible for me. And what I really love is that the selection of meditation recordings are really, it's a very wide range of selections. You have recordings that are 20, 30 minutes, and then you also have recordings that are like 5 minutes, 3 minutes, right? So if you're in between meetings, or you are somewhere, you're waiting for a doctor's appointment, you can really easily just go into that app and receive the benefits of having that, tiny little moments of oasis and respite. And I personally believe that apps can't really replace having teachers, especially if part of your path as a mystic or as a meditator is to study with human teachers and study in community. I don't think that this is necessarily a substitute for that, but I do think it's a beautiful supplement for that. So after many months of using the app myself, really feeling like I benefit from it, and then recommending it to any member of my community, of clients, of students that I feel drawn to recommend it to, I've decided to work with Open to provide a gift for all of you listening. So if you're listening to this podcast and Open sounds interesting to you or you're intrigued, you can get 30 days for free if you use the link that I will be sharing in the show notes below. And for 30 days, you get to test it out. You get to feel into if Open is the right app for you, if you enjoy using them. And if by the end of the 30 days, you don't like it, then that's totally fine. You can simply say no to it. But I would highly recommend that you try it out because it's been a true game changer for me. All right, that is it. If you have been enjoying this contemplation, if you've been enjoying this podcast, as always, feel free to reach out to me if you feel like receiving a reading or having me hold space for you. Links for that will be below in the show notes. And also, I'd love to receive a review. If you haven't taken the time to leave a review, it can be 2 sentences, 3 sentences, very simple, very sweet. And it goes such a long way in encouraging other people to listen to this podcast and to also benefit from it if you happen to benefit from it. All right, I am wishing you a beautiful week, and I hope that you take good care of yourselves. I can't wait to see you again, and until then, I am sending you so much love. Thank you so much for listening.